Welcome to video number 10 in our Deliverance Ministry Seminar. At the end of video number 9, I mentioned that I would share about the names that demons often identify themselves with during a deliverance session. And what we find that it is similar to what we find in the Bible, because we know that when Jesus encountered demons, that the demons identified itself with a name. In Mark chapter 5:9, Jesus asked the demon for its name, and it replied, Legion. Because there are many of us inside this man. I've encountered a demon that identified itself as Legion before. And so you'll also encounter demons that will identify themselves as ungodly characters in the Bible, or as demons that have been mentioned in the Bible, or maybe even mythological gods that we know of down through the ages. And here's some of the names. Some of these demons will identify themselves as Satan, Lucifer, Baal, Apollyon, Moloch, Mammon, Jezebel, Leviathan, Baphomet, Thor, Odin, Lilith. Those are just some of the names that demons identify themselves. And then there are also that identify themselves by their function. And their function being addiction, anger, rage, violence, deaf and dumb, divination, incest, bitterness. And the list of these functions could be endless. So just wanted you to be aware that at any time during a deliverance session, even during interviews, we have had people during interviews where a demon manifested because it knew what was taking place. They knew that we were going to be dealing with an individual's deep emotional wounds, and they didn't want those emotional wounds to be healed. And so they started putting up a fight right from that very beginning. Now, we're going to be doing in this video is looking at generational curses. And so it is one of the steps in the process for a person's deliverance. So going back to our template, which is found on page 60 and 61 in your manual, looking at number 5, the third bullet point down, you'll see break generational curses. On the previous video, we looked at number 5, have the person pray forgiveness prayer, have the person pray soul tie prayer. And in this video, we're going to be looking at breaking generational curses. That is the next step in a person's, in this process for praying for deliverance. Now, we have 4 foundational videos on generational curses. And so what we want you to do is to look at these other videos ahead of time, because they're extremely informational to lay the theological foundation and give you an understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about generational curses. Now, there's a national ministry called Focus on the Family, and they like to use the word psychological legacy. And what they're saying is that there's a legacy that parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, they leave for their children. There's a psychological legacy. Now, Tony Evans, a nationally known minister, he likes to use the term generational consequences. So one generation, the way they live, the way they act, the way they talk, things they do, has a consequence that they pass down to their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and on. And so whether you use generational curses, psychological legacy, or generational consequences, it all means the same thing. So if you turn to page 65 in your manual, we're going to be looking specifically at breaking generational curses. And so if you would look at the top of page 65, it says that people do not know their great-great-grandparents. Most people do not know their great-great-grandparents going back 3, 4, even 10 generations. Nor do they know the things that their ancestors were involved in. And that's a lot of people. You can look at this triangular graph here that shows all of these different people, over 1,000 great-great-grandparents back 10 generations ago. And in the middle of page 65, it says, due to this lack of knowledge, this prayer exercise is conducted to break any evil spirit that would attempt to persist in maintaining its grip on you or your descendants' lives. Sometimes people have been set free using this tool during counseling without even going through deliverance. So this is a very powerful tool in seeing people set free. We have actually seen people, when they were praying through these generational curses, they they just said, I just felt something lift off of me. Not saying that they had something inside them, but they felt it lift off of their shoulders. They felt it lift off their mind. I just feel lighter now, just by praying this particular prayer that we're going to be showing you here in a little bit. So going on in page 65, it says, next paragraph there, it says, use this tool during a deliverance session has proven to be invaluable. This is what has been discovered through its use. Number one is that there's been a lot less violent manifestations. By praying through the list, the legal rights of the enemy are taken away. People yawned, burped, and there were a few manifestations, but not as violent as previously experienced. Number two, time was cut in half for deliverance of individuals after this 40-minute exercise was implemented, and the same results were achieved. So it does take about 40 or so minutes, depending on how well the person can read. It will take that long. So now we're going to look at how to use this tool. Now, see on the bottom of page 65, that heading, how to use this tool. What I'm going to do, I'm going to go directly to a PowerPoint because it's a lot easier to teach, to show you how we lead a person through it than to take you through the instructional method on the bottom of page 65. So let's look over here at generational curses. So I explained to a person in the deliverance session, I explained to them what I have already told you. You see on the top of your page there. And then I have the person pray. Number one, I confess the sins of my ancestors, my parents, and my own sins. So there's a confession that we make. I choose to forgive and release them for these sins, the curses, and the consequences in my life. So there's this freedom that comes. I ask you to forgive me, Lord, for these sins and for yielding to them and to the resulting curses. I receive your forgiveness. Based on your forgiveness, Lord, I choose to forgive myself for involvement in these sins. I renounce these sins and curses. And then what we go to next is categories. And there's 18 of these categories you'll find in your book. And the first category is abandonment and rejection. And so when we get here, the person continues their prayers and they say, I renounce blocked intimacy, desertion, divorce, illegitimacy, isolation, loneliness, neglect, separation. I renounce self-pity, victimization, expected rejection, perceived rejection, self-rejection, rejection of God, and rejection of others. And what we find is quite common. When a person is praying through this, they break down emotionally. They have a dramatic emotional release that takes place, and God begins dealing with that person. And there's healing that comes to them through this process. So after they pray through this particular category of abandonment and rejection, then they pray these two sentences. I break the power of these sins and curses from my life and the lives of my descendants through the redemptive work of Christ on the cross. I receive God's freedom from these sins and curses along with any unknown or unmentioned sins and curses. Instead of abandonment and rejection, I receive. And what we want the person to do, they may have been abandoned, they may have been rejected at different times. We want them to tell us what do they want to receive from God instead of this abandonment and rejection. And so they will tell us, and then what we will do, we will write down on a piece of paper, I want to receive freedom. I want to receive acceptance. And so at the end, we give that person that paper of everything that we have written, of what they choose to receive. Now, sometimes they come to a place where their mind goes blank and they can't think of what they want to receive. And so this next page, what we have here is that there are suggested opposites for abandonment and rejection. These are what other people have chosen. This is not an answer key. This is just to help people's, spark their mind or spark, some ideas of what they could receive from God. And then we go to the next category in this prayer. The next category being poor stewardship. And again, they will pray, I renounce bankruptcy, covetousness, cheating, debt, deception, failure, greed, idolatry of possessions. I renounce irresponsible spending, irresponsibility, job failures, job losses, lack, laziness, neglect, poverty, procrastination. Now, these are things ancestors have done. It isn't saying that this person has done that. This is a psychological legacy that could have been passed on to children. This is generational consequences that could have been passed on to children. And what they're doing, they're praying and they're breaking it off of them. And it can go to more. I renounce robbery, robbing God, stinginess, swindling, drug dealing, and gambling. And at the end of this, they pray, I break the power of these sins and curses from my life and the lives of my descendants through the redemptive work of Christ on the cross. I receive God's freedom from these sins and curses, along with any unknown or unmentioned sins and curses. Instead of poor stewardship, I receive, and we want that person to let us know what they want to receive from God instead of poor stewardship. And if they can't think of anything, because a lot of times the Holy Spirit will give them what He wants to give to them. And so we'll write that down. And if their mind's blank and they can't think of anything, we'll let them know what other people have mentioned in the past. And here's a couple of suggested opposites for poor stewardship, which is prosperity or godly stewardship. And then we'll go to the next category, which is anxiety and fear. And we'll do the same thing through all 18 categories. So that is how we conduct the prayers for breaking generational curses. So it's not overly complicated, but I do want to take you back to page 65. If you do not have this PowerPoint, you're going to look at the bottom of page 65. It says, have the person read prayer 1 through 5 on page 67. So if you turn to page 67 in your manual, you'll have them read number 1 through 5. It says, I confess the sins of my ancestors, my parents, and my own sins. I choose to forgive and release them for these sins, the curses, and the consequences in my life. I ask you to forgive me, Lord, for these sins and for yielding to them and to the resulting curses. I receive your forgiveness. Based on your forgiveness, Lord, I choose to forgive myself for involvement in these sins. I renounce these sins and curses. And then if you go back to page 65, it says, after reading number 5 on page 67, you'll go through the first category found on page 68. That first category on page 68 is abandonment and rejection, which we just showed you on that PowerPoint, which is and it's blocked intimacy. So the person will pray, I renounce blocked intimacy, desertion, divorce, illegitimacy, isolation, loneliness, neglect, and just continue on. And then after they get through that, going back to page 65 again, it says at the end of that category, we just finished the category on page 68, abandonment and rejection. At the end of that category, and after each subsequent category, they're going to read prayer number 6 through 7 on page 67. So if you turn to page 67, I'm going to read number 6, which says, I break the power of these sins and curses from my life and the lives of my descendants through the redemptive work of Christ on the cross. Then number 7, I receive God's freedom from these sins and curses, along with any unknown or unmentioned sins and curses. Instead of abandonment and rejection, I receive. And they write it, and then you will write down for them what they want to receive, the exact opposite. And if you would notice on page 66, we do have the opposites that other people have mentioned over over time, and we have put them on there to help the individual kind of spark their mind, to help them to think of something that they would want to receive from God. So I have just showed you how to conduct generational curses, both by using the video or if you choose to use the paper. Either way, we've shown you how to do that. So there's 18 of these categories, and you let the person pray through each one of them. It is very significant that they do it because you do not know what their ancestors were involved in. They do not know what their ancestors were involved in, and we want to break the psychological legacy. We want to break the generational consequences, or if you want to call it so, we want to break the generational curses off of that individual's life. And as I mentioned before, sometimes praying through these, there were demonic manifestations that took place. Sometimes the individual broke down emotionally. Sometimes another personality emerged and that we dealt with right on the spot. So a lot of things can take place while we're praying to break these generational curses. Now, this is the end of video number 10, and in the next video, we're going to look at prayers for breaking strongholds. And also, I'm going to open up video number 11 with mentioning that these demonic manifestations can occur at any point through a deliverance session, even during interviews.